Jonathan Ike, welcome back to the Baseball Bookshelf.
It's nice to see you again, Ron. Nice to talk to you, always.
This is a collaboration. It's different than your previous book, Jackie Robinson's First Season, which was an excellent book and very well received. Uh, just very quickly, talk about the process of this collaboration. How did you come to this project?
Michael Long, who has put together several books on Robinson and other topics, he's done great books on Bayard Rustin. He had the idea that there was an opportunity to update the Robinson story and really tell it from a bunch of different perspectives. And he asked me if I would consider contributing, and had some ideas for things that I could write about. But he basically left it up to me to, come up with something that I wanted to, that I felt like would be worthy of contributing.
One of the things I noticed in the past decade or two when it comes to biographies, I mean, we've always had biographies about Jackie Robinson, Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, but with every new generation, for lack of a better word, of authors, they keep coming up with new angles, and maybe the research is getting easier to do as more and more things become digitized. What do you think about that?
I think the digitization is a part of it, but I don't think that's the only reason, because you see new biographies of people who like Frederick Douglass, where it's not so much about the newly available digitized newspapers. It's about the fact that we're living in different times than the last biography, and biography is not a final, is never a final word. There's no such thing as a definitive biography. Um, so you need a new one every generation or so to reflect the times in which we're living, as well as the times in which we're writing about. So Jackie Robinson's story is different today than it was when, you know, uh, certainly when the sports writers were covering him, and it was different, and it's different from when the first books like Halberstam's books started to come out. We're living in a different America, and even if you just look from my book, which came out in 2007, 15 years later, we're looking at a very different world, and Robinson's story resonates in different ways. So I think it's worth revisiting.
I'm glad you brought that up because writing in those days, I mean, originally most biographies about baseball players were written for, let's face it, young adults, children. They were full of uh, uplifting stories, overcoming perseverance, overcoming adversity. Uh, but this one is a little different, and I must say, a little darker than a lot of the previous books about Robinson, as they go into his politics, his nonviolent attitude, or the opposite. Uh, when you picked a very interesting topic, because numbers, uniform numbers, have always fascinated me. And again, going back to what it used to be in those days, in the 40s, the 30s, when rookies came up, they were expected to keep their mouths shut, period. Not just Robinson, but they were expected, here's a number, here's a uniform, be grateful you've got it, and shut up. Of course, it was different with Robinson. Backing up a second, do you know what number he wore in the Negro Leagues?
Oh man, I should know that. And now you're stumping me. I used to know it, but it slipped my memory. He certainly didn't wear that high a number with the
Okay.
Monarchs.
So explain the hierarchy of the numbers, how that works. Lower numbers mean one thing, higher numbers mean something else.
When
Describe that.
players first started wearing uniform numbers, it was meant to represent where they batted in the batting order.
Mm.
That's why Babe Ruth was 3 and Lou Gehrig was 4, because it was just simply to keep track of the ordinary batting order, and obviously that changed from day to day. But then the numbers came to mean something, and they came to have significance, and the lower numbers had more status. And those were the numbers that were generally associated with the Stars, in part because of the original fact that it was devoted to the batting order, that it was associated with the batting order. So if you were, 1 through 5, you were, in the top of the lineup. By the time Robinson came along, the numbers were a little bit more random, but it was still clearly a sign that expectations for him were not high, that he was assigned number 42. And it was meant I think, to diffuse some of the tension around him. If they had given him a low single digit number, it would have been yet another slap in the face to the white ball players who didn't want him there. So the Dodgers were playing it safe. The Dodgers, get a lot of credit for being the first team to integrate. Branch Rickey deserves a lot of respect for that. But we should also remember that they were hedging their bets, and giving Robinson number 42 was one of the ways they hedged their bets and sent mixed messages.
Aside from 42, which is clearly Jackie Robinson, he's identified with that number. Maybe Mickey Mantle's number 7. Maybe Babe Ruth's number 3. Hank Aaron's 44. Uh, and maybe Roberto Clemente's 21. Can you think of anyone else who you just say the number and they know who that is? I mean, I guess it depends on which team you follow, because if you follow the White Sox or the Cubs, then you're going to know your history of those guys and who wore what. But let's forget about that for a minute. In the movie 42, and I wonder if they had called it something else. Well, what do you think they could have called it if it wasn't 42?
Opening day?
I came up with I Never Had It Made. I thought that.
Yeah, that's the title of Jackie's first autobiography.
Mhm.
And, it's funny. I think 42, when I hadn't thought about it as a title for my book, but because I don't like numbers in titles, I like words. But in retrospect, I think it was a good choice for the movie title, in part because it's iconic, and in part because now that, when I wrote my book, the league had not yet decided to have everybody wear 42 on April 15th. So that made the number even more iconic. They retired the number just as my book was coming out. So that certainly elevated the status of the number and made sense for the movie to choose that number, because by then Major League Baseball had made number 42 a holy object, HOLY, and that changed the meaning of the number. And if people had already been, if the number had already been retired, maybe that would have been a good title for my book. But I think Robinson's story is interpreted in so many ways, and that's one of the things I love about this book that Michael Long put together, is that you get so many different perspectives on his story and see the different ways that it resonates today. And the number has become a symbol of that, I think.
One of the other chapters in the book is specifically about retiring 42 by David Nays. So I'm hoping to have a chance to chat with him about that. One of the other things, well, first of all, as in perspective, the 1947 Dodgers used 43 people on their roster in that year. Compare that in 2019, the last full season, where there were 67 players on the Seattle Mariners. So nowadays you have players wearing high numbers with pride. Like Aaron Judge, I believe, I'm not a Yankee fan, so they'll forgive me if I get this wrong. I believe he's 99.
That's right.
Okay. So, but that there's no longer stigma involved so much with numbers like it was in those days. In fact, the Yankees have pretty much, haven't they run out of single-digit numbers? They've retired some.
Yeah, they had a 0 this year for the first time. Last year they had a 0 for the first time, which, again, if they'd given that to Robinson, imagine what message that would have sent.
Yeah, that would have been a thing of shame. Just as strikeouts in those days were considered shameful if you struck out too much, and nowadays,
that's right. Now it's a badge of
right.
honor. Right.
Well, one of the other things you wrote about that I found interesting was the continuing controversy of Pee Wee Reese putting his arm around Robinson, and you spoke about the difficult conversation you had with Jackie's wife, Rachel. Talk about that a little bit.
This still drives me nuts, because just this year, some newspaper reporter wrote about that scene with Jackie Robinson and Pee Wee Reese at the middle of the diamond, and Pee Wee putting his arm around Jackie and silencing the crowd in 1947. And the newspaper reporter had a quote in the story that said, "Maybe someday we'll all be wearing number 42." Mm-hmm. And the quote was from the movie.
Right.
So you now have news reporters quoting the movie as if that actually happened. And it makes me crazy. But the point I've been trying to bang home, and I wrote about it in my book, and I talked about it in the Ken Burns documentary, and it comes straight from Rachel. Rachel Robinson told me the first time we talked, it never happened. That scene in 1947, and it's, you know, there's a whole story built around it. It's their first road trip. They're in Cincinnati. It's the furthest south they go in the league at the time, and the crowd is heckling Robinson. And Pee Wee Reese, the white Kentuckian, the captain, walks over and puts his arm around Jackie and silences the crowd and sends this message that he's one of us. But it never happened. It did not happen in 1947 anyway. So things like that happened in 48 and 49. By then, Robinson was accepted, though. It was no great act of bravery to put an arm around his shoulder. He was already the rookie of the year. He'd led the team to the World Series. Um, it was no act of courage for Pee Wee to do that. But in 47, when it would have been an act of courage, he did not do it. And I said to Rachel, you know, why don't you speak out? You know, why did you attended the statue dedication? There's a statue in Brooklyn of that moment with Pee Wee Reese putting his arm around Jackie. You know, I said to Rachel, why do you go to the statue dedication if you object to it? Because she objects to the message that it sends. It sends a message that Jack needed help, that Jack couldn't do this without Pee Wee. And that is just so wrong. He did it without Pee Wee. And when I asked her why, she just kind of shrugged and said, you know, some things are not worth fighting over.
It reminds me of a line from one of my favorite movies, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. At the end of the movie, where the editor says that when the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Yeah.
And I always think about that. But I mean, at some point, obviously, he couldn't have done it all by himself. He did need help. And you talk about acceptance. In the movie, Gene Hermansky is the first one to come over and shake his hand. And then Ralph Branca defends him. Is that accurate at all?
There's some truth there. Branca was one of the first guys. Hermansky was one of the first guys. They did not sign the petition to keep Robinson off the team. They did not threaten to boycott. There were some guys who were quietly supportive. Nobody took a stand. Nobody stood up to their teammates and said, you know, knock it off. Nobody spoke out to the press and said integration is a good thing until until it was a done deal, until it was clear that Robinson wasn't going anywhere. So, you know, I don't give too many of them a whole lot of credit for being pioneers.
When it comes to publishing a book in this pandemic era, that must have been a little bit disappointing, because I imagine had this come out any other time, all you guys would be making personal appearances, appearing at ballparks, the Hall of Fame, host an author series every summer. How difficult was that? I mean, your previous books, both excellent. I'm talking just about your baseball books here, because I haven't read the Ali book yet. Lou Gehrig and Jackie Robinson. I mean, some would say those are the definitive biographies of these players, but yet you say there's no such thing as a definitive biography.
I'll settle for authoritative. How about that? I'd like to write the authoritative books on these subjects, but the stories will be told over and over again, and nobody knows what really goes on inside their subject's head, so I don't think you can be definitive. But as far as missing the fun of being out there promoting the books, well, you know, I miss my parents more. I miss going to the ballpark more. Promoting a book is fun too, but we're all missing a lot of things right now. And I'm lucky that I'm still able to do my work and from home, and I'm still able to keep writing and researching. So you know, I can't complain too much. Thank God, you know, my family's been healthy. So missing out on the book promotion is not the biggest sacrifice.
You have to take everything in perspective. We've been talking today with Jonathan Eig, who contributed to the book 42 Today, Jackie Robinson and His Legacy. Jonathan, thank you very much. Stay healthy.
You too, Ron. Good to see you.